Rexon arriving in Moscow as we speak for meeting with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. Maybe in addition to conversation about Syria and ISIS, conversation about Chechnya. You remember Chechnya has given us the Tsarnaev brothers.
Yes, and that horrible mass killing at that elementary school.
Beslan, 2004, 385 people killed. 186 of them, I believe, were children. And then there's this Daily Mail reporting, which is a Sunni Muslim nation, by the way, for all of the leftists who are so tolerant of totalitarianism, depending on the package. Chechnya opens world's first concentration camp for homosexuals since Hitler's in the 1930s, where campaigners are saying gay men are being tortured with electric shocks and beaten to death. It was claimed that 100 gay men had been detained and 3 killed in Chechnya last week. This from a source at the Russian LGBT network reporting to the Daily Mail. Maybe that should be a topic of conversation as well. Maybe that'll kind of shake up some of the leftists whose ethics is a bit situational when it comes to human rights abuses or worse. For more on all of the above topics, we're pleased to be joined by Michael Rubin, resident scholar for the American Enterprise Institute and the author of a number of books, including Dancing with the Devil and Kurdistan Rising. Michael, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Dan.
So let's start with Rexon in Syria and the continued use of the phrase regime change by the Trump administration national security personnel. Is that appropriate? Is that a good setup for this meeting and for trying to enlist Putin's support, I guess, or acquiescence to deposing Assad?
Well, actually, what's kind of interesting is against the backdrop of the strike, for the first time, the Kremlin spokesman said, preserving Assad isn't necessarily our interest. What happened with Bashar al-Assad, I think, deeply embarrassed the Russians because, after all, they were the guarantor of this agreement with regard to chemical weapons. And so I expect for the first time we're actually going to be able to get our Secretary of State, their foreign minister, sitting down and having a real serious bout of diplomacy because, unfortunately, under Secretary of State John Kerry, the Russians simply didn't see him as credible. They saw his red lines as rhetorical rather than real.
So with this, do you think Rex Tillerson should offer a window or a period of time where Putin can stop backing Assad?
Well, ultimately, what I expect is going to happen isn't going to be full-fledged regime change with the change of system and so forth, but I expect they're going to have the first of a couple serious conversations with regard to, okay, we understand where your red lines are, Russia. You now understand where our red lines are. Let's talk about who we could have in charge. And I expect they're going to be looking for maybe a general from Bashar al-Assad's inner circle so that you have a change of face so the United States can claim victory, someone perhaps with less blood on his hands. At the same time, what Russia doesn't want is a regime which tilts away from Syria being Russia's traditional client state.
Well, right. And so this is the complication from both sides, perhaps for different reasons, which is what comes after Assad. And the answer to that question, at least from all the people I've heard answering it, is kind of sketchy.
Well, that's exactly the case. But when you look at last week's strike on the Syrian airbase, it was very carefully calibrated. It wasn't a decapitation strike. It didn't try to take out the regime. It was just taking out aircraft which were involved in the chemical weapons strike on the town in northern Syria. And so I do think there's a recognition within the White House that you can't leave a vacuum when the only other serious force out there is the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda.
So when do you think President Assad is going to go back to being an ophthalmologist in London?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he must be a liberal because he's a Western-educated doctor. Don't you remember Nancy Pelosi saying that?
Oh, that's right.
By the same logic, Papa Doc Duvalier in Haiti was a liberal.
Oh, Nancy Pelosi is an endless source of unintentional comedy, isn't she? With respect to this, depending on how it goes, what is the next step in terms of trying to offer some cogent framework for dealing with Syria if Assad is not going to be removed from power in the near term?
Well, I expect what's going to happen is you're going to have very quietly, and Rex Tillerson doesn't travel with a lot of people. He doesn't have a lot of aides. You're going to really have a tete-a-tete about who could we have put in place. And then after that, that's when you get the international agreements or, seminars or summits or so forth with all the different players. But what John Kerry and Barack Obama never understood is those fancy public summits aren't to get business done. They're really just to dot the I's and cross the T's. Unfortunately, the previous administration never did that work ahead of time. So what we're going to be looking for is quietly reaching an agreement, and then you can have the summit so everyone can have the rubber stamp approval and claim that it was part of a process. But, diplomacy in the theory of an academic university setting and diplomacy in reality are two very different things.
Does President Obama and his regime, including Benghazi Sue, do they have blood on their hands? I mean, they both said, as did John Kerry, that the chemical weapons caches of Assad's had been removed. They apparently, according to New York Times reporting yesterday, there were administration officials that knew very well that wasn't the case.
Well, that should be something for Congress to say, because they lied to the American people. They lied to the international community, and it's very, very dangerous to gear diplomacy and gear agreements to a fiction rather than reality. So, yes, they do have blood on their hands, but not just for the chemical weapons, for 500,000 people being killed in Syria because they were too busy blaming videos, blaming Republicans, but ultimately doing nothing. I mean, ultimately, the person who should be most ashamed, of course, is Bashar al-Assad, then Barack Obama, and Samantha Power, who is just so arrogant, over the top, and condescending in her tweets, never realizing that tweets don't solve the international problems. I mean, ultimately, you need a much more coherent, comprehensive strategy, oftentimes which includes military action.
Was there ever any evidence that all the chemical weapons were removed from Syria? And who decided that it should be Russia's job to get rid of those chemical weapons in the first place?
Well, ultimately, that was Secretary of State John Kerry and Barack Obama who decided to take Russia at their word. That's like looking into their eyes and expecting to see Putin's soul. And the fact of the matter is, when you there was always a lot of doubt when you parse the phrasing. They said that Russia had gotten rid of all its declared chemical weapons, which then raises the question, what about its undeclared chemical weapons? At the same time, this should be a warning sign not just about Syria, about the trust, the undeserved trust that was put in Iran's nuclear agreement, and this idea of trusting a rogue regime like Iran to self-test itself on uranium and other issues, or to abandon its nuclear program just because it said so. I mean, ultimately, we've got to recognize that our diplomacy is about reaching international agreements. Oftentimes, our enemy's diplomacy is an asymmetric warfare strategy aimed at tying our hands while they proceed apace.
What about North Korea? McMaster mentioned it over the weekend on Fox News Sunday with Chris Wallace. And there's reports out that Trump has ordered his advisors to be ready with a list of options to crush North Korea's nuclear threat, including the possibility of a strike. You've got a U.S. carrier strike group that's been moved towards the Korean Peninsula. How does that play out? Should that play out?
It's deja vu all over again, and now I'm going to put on my nerd cap and go all the way back to 1976, Operation Paul Bunyan. What happened there, Dan?
I knew you were going to go with Operation Paul Bunyan. I knew it. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's probably a generational thing, but for your listeners, and there was a tree blocking the view in the demilitarized zone. The Americans went to chop down the tree with permission. The North Koreans hacked to death 2 American servicemen. It led to an escalation. Ultimately, we sent a carrier strike group, and it was only with that credible threat of military force that North Korea backed down. What's happened in the 4 decades since is whenever North Korea blusters, they get rewarded, so it's no surprise they bluster, but I wouldn't be surprised to see them back down. That said, the reason why the Korean Peninsula is so dangerous is when you look at the South Korean capital of Seoul, it's surrounded, it's within artillery range on 3 sides by the north, and so North Korea doesn't need a nuke. They can simply lob artillery shells at a major metropolis. It would be like lobbing artillery shells at Chicago. Ultimately, I wonder how South Korea's defenses are, whether they have that Israeli-style anti-missile, anti-artillery system.
You think that they would have that in place, though, because it's not when it's not where, it's when it's going to happen, don't you think?
I suspect so, but this also raises questions about the other administration, where we have a Democratic ally that develops, with the United States actually, a great anti-missile system. It develops a great anti-tunneling system. You'd think we'd want to reward this ally. We think we'd want to share the technology along our southern border, among our allies and so forth, instead of just bashing the democratically elected leader nonstop.
He is Michael Rubin, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, author of a number of books, Dancing with the Devil, Kurdistan Rising among them. Michael, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Dan. Thanks, Amy.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.